Good morning and welcome everyone to the open house on evidence for scaling up economic inclusion programs. I am so glad today we're going to hear about the rich experience, and we hope to have a very active interactive session. So I'd like to invite you to use the chat box to introduce yourself and also use it to ask questions, make comments, and be very active in the section that is to come. This is simultaneous, that we have simultaneous interpretation in Arabic, French, Portuguese, and Spanish. So please click on the globe icon at the bottom of your screen to change the channel. I'll ask you to do so also if you are an English speaker, because we do have French speakers on the panel and you'd like to be ready with the interpretation. So I'd like to introduce our speaker and participants to the event. PEI Open House webinar series gathers global and country experts on strategic thinking around economic inclusion programming and innovations across countries. This is the 6th open house focusing on the emerging evidence for government-led economic inclusion program. This open house is organized by the Partnership for Economic Inclusion in collaboration with DIME and IPA, and features a rich set of country experiences, including Niger, Senegal, and Zambia. We encourage everybody to see our live tweet. This event goes on at PEI Global _org. So I'd like to start off this open house on the emerging evidence for government-led economic inclusion programs by thinking about the first generation of studies. The first generation of studies showed that the economic inclusion program can be extremely effective at targeting the poorest, the most vulnerable people in different countries, including very fragile countries, and help them escape the cycle of poverty by boosting their incomes and help them really transform the productive capacity of their households. Not only that, but we have shown through different experiences and long-term follow-up of these families after the conclusion of these programs that we can actually affect their livelihood in a sustainable manner. And this is really exciting, of course. These are not just temporary programs, but programs that can provide a longer-term solution to poverty reduction and reduction in vulnerabilities. And so today, with everything that is happening from the climate change side and different shocks, we want to really welcome these models into new ways of addressing the distributional consequences of climate change shocks and policies, and think about how we move forward with a scaled up strategy for these programs. Now, of course, as we move to scale, a whole set of new challenges. We'll need to face a whole new set of challenges. So first, there are institutional and implementation challenges, of course, thinking about how to scale up through government systems. Second, there are critical learning gaps that we want to address. So to understand how to optimally design these programs to maximize cost effectiveness, but also to ensure that we don't lose the gains that we have found in the first stage of these programs. And third, as these interventions move to scale, it will be critical to assess potential synergy with policies in other sectors. I mentioned already climate change, but there are, of course, interventions in agriculture, digitization, transport, skill development, etc. So the important question ahead is, what do we need to learn to scale up government-led economic inclusion program? In the next few years and through this partnership will be critical to understand how to do this right and continue addressing the plea of the poorest and most vulnerable people that we are trying to serve. So to address these learning priorities, we have set up a partnership we've set up through the partnership of economic inclusion and the collaboration with my own department, the Development Impact Evaluation Group and technical partners all over the world, to launch something that we called an Impact Evaluation Collaborative on moving economic inclusion to scale, with the goal of informing an evidence-based scale-up of economic inclusion programs. And so as part of this collaborative, we are targeting between 6 and 10 government-led economic inclusion programs to be supported in the design and implementation of robust impact evaluations by leading experts and researchers around the world, with the idea of supporting governments through all the cycle of designing implementations of these programs and ensure their success. I think one of the main elements of the approach is what we call adaptive programming, as we put in place a research team and data capabilities and analytical capabilities for these governments to implement their program in a different way that they would have done in the past, really counting with a lot of input from the research teams to support their process. So we going to move into the agenda now, and I'd like to present our panel. The first presentation will be from Patrick Clement, who's a senior economist at DIME. He will focus on the impact and cost effectiveness of government-led productive inclusion measures in rural Niger and urban Senegal. And we'll see some interesting differences between the two cases. Next, we will hear from Amadou Kanar Diop, who is the technical advisor to the Minister of Community Development and Social and Territorial Equity. And I hope he will reflect on how the evidence is informing the plans for scale up of the productive inclusion program in Senegal, which is currently ongoing. And then we will listen to Joanna. Joanna Botea is an economist at the World Bank, who will discuss the evidence from a program in Zambia called JUO. And finally, we'll have in our panel Lars Brun, who I hope will talk to us about the challenges of moving impact evaluation to scale. He's an accomplished researcher who has led multiple impact evaluation globally in social protection and the graduation space. And we would like him to reflect for us on the emerging evidence and how do we think about the future, especially in the context of large scale ups of this program. So I'd like to remind everyone that we have a chat box. Please, again, introduce yourself, use it to communicate with the panel and ask questions, make comments. We're welcoming all of you to this wonderful session. And now I'm going to pass the mic to Patrick. Thank you, Patrick.
Thank you, Ariana. And I'm very happy to be with you today to present some early results from the Sahel. This is based on a collaboration with the Sahel Adaptive Social Protection Program, with IPA, with the Africa Gender Innovation Lab, DIME, as well as government partners and NGOs across the Sahel, including Trickle Up. So we know that national social protection systems can offer a platform to deliver economic inclusion intervention. But the big question is really, can multifaceted economic inclusion packages be effectively delivered to those national systems? You know, is it doable? Is it impactful? Is it cost effective? And how do we optimize the design and the delivery of those programs? So this is what we have set out to do across the Sahel a few years ago. I'm very happy to report on the results today, focusing on early results from rural Niger, as well as urban Senegal. What's very exciting is that there is already a scale-up underway in those two countries based on those results. And we're also awaiting results from Mauritania, Burkina Faso, and Chad in the coming months. So what is the model that has been tested in the Sahel? So the economic inclusion package included core components, starting with the formation of group of beneficiaries, that receive coaching from community coaches or local volunteers. Those beneficiaries formed savings groups. They received micro-entrepreneurship training, as well as some facilitation of access to markets through the community coaches. Then on top of those core components were added two psychosocial components, one including a community sensitization on aspirations and social norms, and the second, a life skills training. And then the last element of the package was a cash grants that amounted to about $140 in Niger and about $250 in Senegal. Now, these packages were the same across the Sahel, but the setting varied quite a bit. So to give you a sense, the program in Niger targeted rural areas, so mostly relatively small villages. It targeted the recipient of the National Cash Transfer Program, in those cases, mostly the wife of one of the household heads. So the beneficiary on average is 47-year-old, has 0 years of education, and lives about 72 minutes from the closest market. On the other hand, in Senegal, the program targeted urban areas in 3 regions. It targeted either the cash transfer program recipient, if she was less than 45-year-old, or a younger person in the households, for instance, the son or the daughter of the cash transfer recipient. And so on average, the beneficiary of the productive measures is 32 years old, has 6 years of education, and lives about 18 minutes from the market. So, but across those settings, we tested similar things. We tested whether the overall economic inclusion package was effective by comparing beneficiaries that received the full package to a control group that only received regular cash transfers. We also tested whether there was a value added of including the cash grants in the package. So we have some beneficiaries that receive a package that includes everything but the cash grants, so we can test the value added of that grant. And then similarly, we test whether there's a value added of the psychosocial components. And here we find that we have a set of beneficiaries that receive the full package minus the community sensitization and life skills. So all of this gives us a good sense of how effective this is and how best to design such multifaceted interventions. So what do we find? So let's start with Niger. In Niger, we find substantial impact on household consumption. So you see on the left here, I'm showing you in gray the control group, and then in blue, the capital package, in green, the psychosocial package, and in yellow, the full package. And you see on the left here that 6 months after the end of the intervention, we see substantial impact on consumption from 5 to 13%, and that those effects are sustained 18 months after the end of the program, here on the right, where you see impact on consumption from 7 to 15%. One noteworthy element here is that the impact on consumption of the psychosocial package actually tend to increase over time, while the impact of the other packages tend to be sustained. What is driving those substantial results on consumption? Well, we see mostly large increases in business revenues for women beneficiaries. You see here on the left that revenues from micro businesses from female beneficiaries increased from 62% to 170% 18 months after the end of the intervention. So these are really large effects that tend to be a little bit larger in the capital and the full packages. We also see some increase in agricultural revenues, especially for packages with the psychosocial components, and increases in livestock revenues for packages with the cash grants. Aside from those economic effects, we also find substantial improvements in psychosocial outcomes. So we have on the left here some indicator of psychological well-being that again increase substantially across the 3 packages, and then effects on social well-being that also increase pretty substantially across the packages. I'm not going to go into the nuance between packages here, but overall fairly robust effects on psychological and social well-being. How does that look in terms of overall cost effectiveness? So when we compare the cost of the package, which range from $290 in the psychosocial package to $644 in the full package, to the consumption benefits that we observe, we find a very large rate of returns. In fact, we find that the consumption impact up to 1 year after the end of 18 months after the end of the interventions that we observe is already larger than the program cost for the packages, the psychosocial and the food package. When we make relatively weak assumption about how long those impacts may be sustained, we find that very quickly the capital package also becomes cost effective as well. But overall, what is striking is that those rates of returns are very high. In fact, they seem to be even higher than some of the very successful graduation programs in the literature, which shows that, yes, it is feasible to deliver to government systems. And in fact, it may be of extremely good value as well in terms of high returns. So now, what are we finding in Senegal? In Senegal, I'm presenting here early results that we are still finalizing. So looking forward to discussion on this. What we find in Senegal is that we find effect on consumption. We find effects from 4 to 6% from a higher base in Senegal, especially in the capital and the food package. The psychosocial package doesn't have a statistically significant effect, but we cannot tell that those are different from each other. We do also find that increases in food consumption are observed across the 3 packages. Again, this is about 18 months post-intervention. What is driving those results? Here we do find some differences between packages. We find again that it is the increases in business revenues from the female participants and beneficiary that tend to be driving the effect on consumption. So we see impact on business revenues from 22 to 24%. But those effects are driven by the arms with the cash grants. We do not see an effect on business revenue from the arm just with the core and psychosocial components. Similarly, we do not see effects on other sources of revenues, whether agriculture or livestock, which is okay, which is normal because it's in urban areas, or wages. We also see some nuance in terms of the social and psychological impacts of the program. So if you look here on the left, we do not see effects on indicators of psychological well-being across any of the 3 packages. We do see on the right some effect on social well-being, mostly related to the ability of individuals to mobilize financial support where they are hit by a shock, and mostly driven by the packages with the cash grants, with less effects from the psychosocial package. We see other effects on collective action as well. So we see effect on the social dimension, but much less on the psychological dimension compared to what we see in Niger. So where does that leave us? I would say that overall, we find relatively strong results in terms of impact of those multifaceted economic inclusion interventions delivered through government systems in both Niger and Senegal. In Niger, we see that the packages with the psychosocial components are the most cost effective. They have very strong impacts at low cost and high rates of returns. We haven't yet finalized the cost benefit analysis in Senegal. The psychosocial package is the cheapest, and so it may still prove the most cost effective in Senegal. But overall, we do find that the psychosocial components seem to have lower economic effects in urban Senegal than in rural Niger. We also see that the effects on psychosocial well-being are also more muted in urban Senegal than in rural Niger. And so in a way, the contrast here, we still have to analyze this in more details, but the contrast suggests that the effectiveness of those psychosocial components may very well vary across context, and they may be relatively less needed in urban settings or among younger or more educated population. Here, if we contrast urban Senegal to rural Niger. So again, with this, I will conclude, and we are very excited that those results are being used in the scale-up of those programs. And again, I want to thank everyone in this broad collaboration for their contributions. Thank you. Over.
Thank you, Patrick. That was excellent. I had a follow-up question for you to kind of understand some of the differences between the Niger and Senegal case, and especially between rural, which may be driven by rural and urban. But I wanted to hear your opinion in terms of these differences, but also kind of understand if you can elaborate a bit on the urban model. We are all quite familiar with the rural model and the type of interventions that are incentivized in those rural communities. But I was wondering whether you could explain a little more what are the type of productive activities that are incentivized in urban settings.
Yes, thank you, Ariana. And I think Kana will be able to say much more on this. One of the design discussion we had at early stages was whether the economic inclusion interventions should steer participants into specific activities. And we actually decided against that from the beginning, in the sense that the economic inclusion intervention is kind of a path for individuals to think through what is it that which activity seem to be the more profitable and the more of interest to them. And so in a way, the whole content of the intervention is designed so that it's blind to the specific activity they will invest on, but it's aimed to inform the choice that of the activity that they may decide. And so, for instance, in rural areas, we will have discussion of agricultural and non-agricultural activities. So the entrepreneurship training covers both. Similarly, the life skills training and the community sensitization try to illustrate how individuals may diversify livelihoods, may think about adding activities, but without specifically saying, you should do this activity or that one. So the model in that sense was similar in urban areas. Now, of course, we have much more, as you see, involvement in livestock and agriculture in rural areas. In urban areas is mostly micro businesses, in self-employment type of activities, in either commerce or small scale transformation, and so on. But I think overall, the intervention itself was quite similar in terms that it was geared to help guide individuals, not kind of prescribe specific activities.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you, Patrick. This is a very nice intro for Amadou Canard's job's comments. He will be speaking in French. So again, please make sure that you select your channel. Canard, very welcome to our panel. We know Senegal is in the middle of a scale up of its economic inclusion program. So we'd like to understand from you, and also I understand you're scaling up in rural areas, so the Niger experience may be quite interesting. And we would like to understand from you if you can comment on how the evidence has informed the plans to scale up the productive inclusion program in Senegal, and how do you see the main challenges? In fact, one of our guests in the chat box was asking what are the enabling conditions for this scale up. The question was addressed to Patrick, but I think it would be interesting to hear from you, Canard, on how do you see the main challenges and enabling conditions to move the program forward.
Bonjour à tous. Je suis en train de partager mon écran. Je ne sais pas si c'est OK.
Oui, bonjour. On attend.
OK.
While you share your screen, I want to say we have a wonderful set of in the audience, wonderful set of partners from all over the world, and also researchers from all over the world. The next phase of this program will incorporate local researchers into our work. So we're very welcoming of high participation from all the global actors. Canard, back to you. Are you able to share?
Oui, je suis en train de le faire, mais ça ne semble pas marcher. Sarah, tu pourrais peut-être partager si tu es là?
Perfect.
OK, merci à tous. Donc, comme ça a été dit, je suis Amadou Canard Diop, conseiller technique au niveau du ministère du Développement communautaire, de l'équité sociale et territoriale au Sénégal. Donc, c'est le ministère qui s'occupe du secteur de la protection sociale. Je vais partager avec vous l'expérience du Sénégal en parlant d'abord du contexte. Ensuite, je vais m'appesantir sur les motifs, les raisons pour lesquelles nous avons entrepris un changement d'échelle. Et ensuite, je vais terminer par les défis et les modalités de mise en œuvre à un niveau général, mais également au niveau du système gouvernemental. Et je vais terminer par des questionnements, sachant qu'il y a beaucoup de chercheurs qui qui sont en train de nous suivre. Donc, concernant le Sénégal, je voudrais commencer par dire que nous sommes dans un contexte où depuis 2012, nous essayons de mettre en place un système de protection sociale intégré avec plusieurs outils. Parce qu'il y a une nouvelle politique qui est développée et qui tourne autour d'un document de politique publique qui a 3 axes. Et le deuxième axe concerne le capital humain, la protection sociale et le développement durable. C'est dire que c'est vraiment une priorité pour les autorités gouvernementales de ce pays. Donc, depuis 2012, nous développons principalement 2 outils dans le cadre de ce système de protection sociale. Le premier, c'est le programme national de bourse, donc un programme de cash transfert conditionnel qui est à l'échelle nationale, donc ça concerne tout le territoire du pays. Et depuis 2013, nous sommes en train de faire un cash transfert à 20% de la population du Sénégal. Et ça a suivi plusieurs phases sur lesquelles vous pourrez vous documenter. Je pourrais envoyer de la documentation au besoin. Le deuxième outil qui nous paraît très important, c'est le registre national unique. Parce qu'on s'est rendu compte qu'il y a une étude que nous avons effectuée justement avec la Banque mondiale qui s'est rendu compte qu'il y avait une grande fragmentation des programmes de protection sociale. Et il y avait un grand défi par rapport au ciblage et ça ne permettait pas d'avoir une bonne approche pour la réduction de la pauvreté. Donc, à partir de 2015, nous avons mis en place un registre national unique qui cible tous les ménages qui sont en situation de pauvreté ou de vulnérabilité. Donc, actuellement, nous sommes à peu près à 38% de la population et depuis quelques mois, nous avons institutionnalisé ce registre national unique par décret. Et cela impose à tous les programmes sociaux d'utiliser le registre national unique pour le système de ciblage. Au-delà des outils de protection sociale que nous avons, le gouvernement du Sénégal a mis en place 2 grands programmes de protection sociale. C'est la couverture maladie universelle qui concerne actuellement 52% de la population, alors qu'en 2012, on était seulement à 20%. Donc, vraiment, en 10 ans, on a fait un grand bond par rapport à la couverture maladie universelle. Nous avons également ce qu'on appelle la carte d'égalité des chances pour les handicapés, et cela permet en fait de leur octroyer des services spécifiques. Ce qui est important à retenir dans ce système, c'est que tout cela est intégré. Les bénéficiaires du programme national de bourse qui sont enrôlés à partir du registre national unique sont enrôlés également dans la couverture maladie universelle, tout comme les bénéficiaires de la carte d'égalité des chances sont enrôlés dans le programme national de bourse. C'est ça en fait que nous appelons une approche intégrée de la protection sociale. Maintenant, à partir de 2016, en collaboration avec la Banque mondiale, nous avons testé un nouveau système de protection sociale adaptative. L'idée, c'est de voir comment utiliser les outils de la protection sociale pour développer une approche inclusive, une approche productive en faveur des bénéficiaires. Pourquoi? Parce qu'en fait, au début du programme, vu que c'était nouveau, ce n'était pas très connu, il y a eu beaucoup de critiques qui disaient qu'il ne suffisait pas seulement de donner de l'argent. Donc, nous développons depuis 2016 ce programme de protection sociale adaptative pour accompagner les ménages dans leur autonomisation, mais également accompagner les petits producteurs à avoir accès aux intrants agricoles. En faisant le programme de protection sociale adaptative, il faudrait retenir 3 choses. La première, c'est que nous avons avec 8 pays d'Afrique de l'Ouest qui sont dans la zone sahélienne, donc qui sont touchés par une insécurité alimentaire, des aléas liés au climat, et avec des universitaires et des experts de la Banque mondiale, fait vraiment un benchmarking assez important pour avoir un design du projet qui pouvait correspondre aux besoins des ménages en fait, que nous sommes chargés d'accompagner. Donc, il y a vraiment un grand effort qui a été fait dans le benchmarking et dans le design du projet. Il y a également un grand effort qui a été fait pour aller recueillir les besoins des communautés avec des études, avec des focus groups, etc., pour vraiment connaître leurs besoins par rapport à l'autonomisation. Et nous avons commencé à implémenter, comme l'a dit Patrick, le programme à partir de 2016 et on s'est rendu compte qu'au bout de 18 mois, le programme avait vraiment un impact réel, sachant qu'il y avait une augmentation assez importante au niveau des ménages qui avaient été enrôlés et que les activités étaient plus élevées par rapport à 22%. Le deuxième aspect, c'est que leur consommation avait augmenté de 6%. Et quand on a eu la crise de la COVID-19, on s'est rendu compte que ces ménages-là qui étaient accompagnés étaient vraiment beaucoup plus résilients que les autres ménages qui n'avaient pas bénéficié de ce programme. Cela veut dire quoi? Cela veut dire qu'il est important en fait d'aller à une mise à l'échelle de la protection sociale adaptative en prenant en compte ce qui est fait par rapport au cash transfert, ce qui est fait par rapport à la couverture maladie universelle. Maintenant, pour cela, il est
Kanar, I think you muted by mistake. Can you unmute?
Okay, I'm okay?
Yeah.
Okay. Le premier aspect par rapport au défi, c'était la couverture géographique. Le Sénégal est composé de 14 régions. Nous avions fait le pilote sur 3 régions. Maintenant, il faudrait qu'on aille sur l'ensemble des régions du Sénégal, vu qu'il y avait une forte demande de la part des populations. Le deuxième point, c'est qu'il fallait un alignement du paquet de services et il fallait qu'on le rende un peu plus flexible, tout en favorisant le dialogue et la collaboration entre tous les acteurs qui contribuent à l'implémentation du programme sur la base d'un principe de subsidiarité, sachant que nous sommes vraiment au niveau des villages et au niveau des communautés. Pour le gouvernement, il y a un défi qui est important, sachant qu'on utilise les outils de la protection sociale pour l'autonomisation des ménages. Donc, on est dans l'agriculture, on est dans l'élevage, on est dans des activités qui reviennent à d'autres ministères. Donc, nous faisons tout pour que cela soit internalisé au niveau des autres ministères. Nous avons une forte collaboration avec le ministère de l'Agriculture, par exemple, pour l'accès des petits producteurs aux intrants agricoles. Et nous avons également une forte collaboration avec les collectivités territoriales et les autorités administratives. En général, c'est eux qui mènent les séances de sensibilisation. C'est eux également qui gèrent tout ce qui est réclamation et tout ce qui est suivi et évaluation participatif de la part des bénéficiaires. Next slide, please. Donc, au-delà du défi concernant la nécessité d'internaliser cette approche au niveau de tous les ministères et de faire de telle sorte que les autorités locales et les autorités administratives puissent participer et qu'on puisse favoriser le suivi et évaluation de la part des communautés, il faudrait également qu'on arrive à financer correctement ce programme, sachant que le programme national de bourse de la couverture maladie universelle prennent déjà beaucoup d'argent au niveau du budget national. Par rapport à ça, nous avons fait beaucoup d'études qui montrent que si on arrive à prendre 7% du budget national pour le secteur de la protection sociale, on pourrait valablement arriver à financer ce projet, cette politique de protection sociale intégrée en y rajoutant la protection sociale adaptative. Donc, le défi du financement est vraiment important et nous sommes en train d'y travailler et de porter le plaidoyer au niveau des autorités gouvernementales. Au-delà des défis concernant le gouvernement, nous nous sommes rendus compte que la mise en place d'un système de protection sociale intégré allant du cash transfert jusqu'à l'inclusion productive nous interpelle par rapport à un certain nombre de questions. Au Sénégal, quand on a commencé le programme de bourse, c'est posé la question de savoir quel allait être l'impact sur la pauvreté. Et nous nous rendons compte que les évaluations de process, les études empiriques que nous avons effectuées, nous poussent à dire que si on a un paquet complet, un paquet intégré allant du cash transfert à l'inclusion productive en passant par la couverture maladie universelle, nous pouvons avoir un impact direct et rapide sur la réduction de la pauvreté, en favorisant une graduation des ménages comme le modèle Brax qui est connu de tout le monde. Donc, c'est vraiment une évidence scientifique à explorer. Est-ce que ce paquet complet pourrait avoir un impact rapide et important sur la réduction de la pauvreté? Le deuxième aspect, c'est est-ce que également cela n'a pas un impact sur la protection sociale prophylactique? Est-ce que si on a ce paquet complet, ça ne permettrait pas aux ménages d'être beaucoup plus résistants, beaucoup plus résilients face au choc? Voilà en gros ce que je voulais vous présenter en vous remerciant de votre attention. Merci.
Thank you, Kanal. This was illuminating. You raised a super important point, of course, which is kind of fiscal sustainability of a large intervention such as what you describe, an integrated system of social protection. But it seems also evident from all the discussion by Patrick and you that this is not just social protection, but it's actually increasing the productive capacity of poor and vulnerable people in your countries and kind of and transition them to non-poverty status. And in so doing, the dynamics and one of the questions I would have for researchers is how do we look at the economic impact and increase in economic activity of such an effort, of course, from the short term to the medium term to the long term, and how transformative such an effort can be in securing higher growth for our economies. So I have a follow-up question for you, Kanar, regarding the pressures. You mentioned all the different components of the system, including the health insurance component and the pressure that may create on government systems and services. How do you work with other actors in Senegal, NGOs and private providers of services to come up with a strategy for dealing with the increased demand pressures on services?
Oui, merci. En fait, c'est une pression très positive parce que, par exemple, pour la protection sociale adaptative, c'est vraiment une forte demande de la part des élus locaux et de toutes les communautés. C'est justement ça qui a poussé à ce qu'on aille à la mise à l'échelle très rapidement. La logique aurait voulu qu'on aille peut-être sur 3 régions de plus, mais la demande est tellement forte, tellement pressante, et cela a demandé qu'on aille au niveau de toutes les régions. Maintenant, comment y arriver? Le gouvernement du Sénégal fait ce qu'on appelle du faire-faire. Nous sommes en collaboration avec des ONG qui implémentent, par exemple, les séances de sensibilisation dont Patrick a parlé. Ça, ce sont des ONG qui sont au niveau local, qui font ce travail. Le système de suivi et évaluation, le système de la gestion des réclamations, ça également, c'est des ONG qui accompagnent le gouvernement, qui font ce travail. Et tout à l'heure, j'ai parlé d'internalisation au niveau des autres ministères. Par exemple, pour l'accès des petits producteurs aux intrants agricoles, nous sommes dans une forte collaboration avec le ministère de l'Agriculture. Ce sont les agents du ministère de l'Agriculture qui sont au niveau local, au niveau des communes, au niveau des départements, qui font les séances de formation et qui font le suivi des activités, le suivi des bénéficiaires qui sont effectués. Maintenant également, nous avons une très bonne collaboration avec le ministère des Finances et bien entendu avec les partenaires au développement pour que tout cela soit financé convenablement, mais également qu'on puisse avoir des évidences scientifiques qui permettront de continuer à pousser le gouvernement à investir dans la protection sociale dans le cadre d'une durabilité. Parce qu'ici, nous sommes davantage convaincus que la protection sociale est plus un investissement que de l'assistanat social. Et le paquet de protection sociale que je vous ai montré prouve que si on investit dans la protection sociale, on pourrait avoir des impacts directs et rapides sur la pauvreté des ménages. En 2011, on était à peu près à 46,7% de taux de pauvreté. Et en 2019, selon la Banque mondiale, on serait à 36 à 37% de taux de pauvreté. Cela veut dire qu'en moins de 10 ans, vraiment avec tout ce qui a été fait, combiné bien entendu à d'autres projets, programmes d'urgence concernant l'accès aux services sociaux de base, etc. Tout cela a permis au Sénégal de réduire considérablement son taux de pauvreté, d'une part, et d'autre part, de rendre les ménages vulnérables beaucoup plus résilients par rapport aux chocs et par rapport aux crises comme ceux qu'on a connus récemment. Merci.
Merci, Kana. We'll pass now to Ioana Botea to give us a description of the dual program in Zambia and talk to us about the results there. Ioana, to you.
Hi, good morning, good afternoon, everyone. And hi, can you hear me? Yeah. Good morning, everyone. And thank you, Ariana. It's a pleasure to be here. And I'm really looking forward to the discussion. So today I'm going to be talking about an impact evaluation from Zambia that was conducted by the Africa Gender Innovation Lab. And before I dive into the impact evaluation and the results, just a few words about the intervention itself. So supporting women's livelihoods is part of the Jewel project and was launched in 2015, just when the really promising evidence on the so-called graduation approach pilots was coming out. So from the outset and, kind of very much related to today's topic, we wanted to build on the emerging evidence while also finding ways to scale up the model in a way that's both effective and sustainable. So that first translated into a streamlined package that lasts about a year compared to 2 as we saw with Senegal and Niger. And that includes just 4 components, namely short-term life and business skills training, a productive grant equivalent to $225 that's delivered in 2 installments, usually through mobile money. And then these are followed by 6 months of group mentorship and support to form savings groups. In addition, and I think this is really important to emphasize, the key innovation under SWL is that it actually hasn't outsourced any activities to NGOs or any other implementation partners. And instead, the government chose to deliver everything directly through its decentralized ministry structures and community-based volunteers. It also essentially started at scale. SWL was reaching around 35,000 beneficiaries at the time of the impact evaluation a couple of years ago. And now it's on track to reach 129,000 beneficiaries by 2024, almost nationwide, essentially in all rural districts of the country. Okay, so moving on to the impact evaluation. Here again, we wanted to focus on scalability and get a better sense of how best to optimize the package. So we unbundled it and tested 4 versions of SWL. First, the full package that I've just described, then full package plus consumption support that mimics the government's cash transfers program. Actually, we then find statistical differences between the first arms. So I'm going to show you pool results just to keep that in mind. And then there's financial capital only arm that includes the productive grant and savings groups, and a human capital only arm that includes the life and business skills training and group mentoring. And then everyone, including the control group, received phones because the project was handing them out as in an effort to facilitate digital payments. We're also going to measure spillover and general equilibrium effects, so kind of effects on non-beneficiaries and the community more broadly. I won't talk about these results today, but I thought it's important to mention since this is something that I think is really key to understanding both the potential and the challenges of economic inclusion programming at scale. Okay, so what does the evidence show? The full package results that I'm showing you now really seem to confirm that bundled economic inclusion programs can be very effective, even when delivered at scale and directly by the government. So we see large and positive effects across the board. If we look at consumption, it increased by 21% relative to the control group, or 0.23 like standard deviations, which is comparable to the Niger results that we saw earlier. And then although the follow-up, I'm showing you midline results, so the follow-up wasn't as far out, it was still at the point where individuals were unlikely to be still consuming the grant itself. And if we kind of look at these impacts at the household level, we see that the annual impact is about $200. So just that almost matches the value of the grant. Then we also see that household revenue also increased significantly. And as in the case of Niger and Senegal, this was mainly driven by an increase in off-farm income generating activities. Beneficiaries reported 50% more businesses and 70% higher profits. So yeah, that's quite significant. I won't go through every indicator, but we also see a significant increase in savings that more than doubled relative to the control group. And beneficiaries also increased their assets and livestock. And kind of beyond the direct economic impacts, we also see wide-ranging effects on other dimensions, including improved food security and subjective well-being. Just like two notable indicators where we did not see an impact are self-esteem and decision-making. But this wasn't entirely surprising because SWL beneficiaries were chosen for being female breadwinners, so they already had quite high baseline values in these dimensions to begin with. However, this kind of what I just showed you, the full package results seem to be showing us just part of the story. And when we unbundle the package, it appears that the effects were entirely driven by the financial capital arm, or kind of the productive grant and savings groups. And as you can see in these graphs, the results for the full package and financial capital arm are indistinguishable, pretty much across the indicators, while the human capital arm on its own has no benefits compared to the control. Yeah, honestly, this was quite surprising because the skills training is popular with beneficiaries, and indeed take up and attendance rates were very high. So then, if it wasn't take up, the lack of impact that we see for the training may have been either due to poor implementation, or theoretically that it didn't relax binding constraint, and money is all that the beneficiaries needed. So we are working to further unpack these results. What we know so far, based on a phone survey that was done shortly after the training, it was for COVID, but we asked questions about this as well, is that beneficiaries had better knowledge of business concepts than non-beneficiaries, but the differences were quite small and inconsistent. In any case, kind of smaller than we would expect after, pretty much right after 3 weeks of engaging with the content. So this seems to support kind of the implementation challenges explanation, but we'd like to further unpack the results, as I said, and the questions we're asking ourselves is, was the information too diluted along this like multi-level cascade training of trainers, as the government had to train thousands of community-based volunteers, or maybe community-based volunteers didn't have the right profile for the role. So yeah, we're actually conducting additional data collection right now to try to better answer these questions. Okay, so what does this mean? First, the evidence is quite strong that governments can successfully deliver just productive grants, or I guess this would be better described as like labeled grants for productive investments at scale, and with very large impacts. So this might be good enough in settings where institutional capacity for skills training is very low, or perhaps even as a first stage before additional elements are layered on. That said, I think there's definitely reason to believe that the results could have been stronger if the training or training plus mentorship was implemented better. And although we're not aware, at least, of any other study that isolated just the training on its own, it's been shown quite consistently that multi-pronged interventions are more effective than grant-only ones. So, although the results in Zambia are quite impressive, we may have not reaped the full benefits if the intervention had been implemented as designed. So just to wrap up, I think what the Zambia experience really highlights is that, at scale, it's not necessarily more of the same, and we need to learn more about, specifically how to deliver training to very large numbers of beneficiaries. And I think it's quite clear that there are important HR constraints to scale up, both in terms of staff numbers and their capacity. And I think this challenge is exacerbated in low density contexts like Zambia, where capacity building and supervision are even more challenging. So I think more research and experimentations are needed to better understand how to do this right. Thank you.
Thank you, Joanna. Excellent. One of the things I've learned in your presentation is the fact that we really need to think about implementation and the ability to ensure compliance with implementation protocols. And so I was very excited by Kanar's comments on kind of building an integrated system. And these integrated adaptive systems are not only to evaluate, of course, but they're really to monitor and manage the process. We cannot expect effects if we actually don't deliver on the interventions. And so this is really a wonderful collaborative that I hope will focus on both parts of the agenda, building the systems and the capacity and government capacities to manage these programs in a way as to ensure compliance, as well as putting in place the experiments and the learning that then can help us lead to greater and greater cost effectiveness. And this is a wonderful opening into Las's comments. And I would like to ask Las a bit of his vision on discussing how we move from working with smaller scale interventions, maybe with NGOs, to larger scale programs in collaborations with governments. What are the challenges from a methodological point of view, but also kind of from an implementation side? The last, we're a little behind schedule, but I'm sure we can cover all the wonderful ideas that you will put on the table last. Mike, to you.
Okay, thank you. Can you hear me? All right.
Perfectly.
Yeah. Let me maybe start by reflecting briefly on the what we've seen today and the importance of these studies, and to put this in context here. I think the contributions that we've seen from today, they're going to be extremely important, and there's some details we'll get filled in on later, given the short presentations, but those look like landmark studies to me, showing the viability of bringing economic inclusion programs to scale. So the basic level, similar to other studies, it's encouraging that we can move the needle substantially with the really still relatively simple bundle. And then here, beyond what we've seen previously, this can be done in large numbers and at least for some of the sites, very, very favorable cost-benefit ratios, where previously we saw limited roles of government in these studies, and this can matter, of course, as we've discussed, for these reasons of quality implementation, logistics, bureaucracy, and so forth. And what we really want to know if these prior programs' successes are replicable at scale, and so there's a huge step forward here. One thing that I found almost shocking, again, without knowing all the details, is the cost effectiveness here at scale. So Ariana, you mentioned earlier that previous studies had sort of high returns, but the high returns, they are really in some sense dependent on the persistence of those effects over longer time periods. The evidence there is quite limited and in fact somewhat mixed to the extent that we have it. And so then seeing the cost effectiveness with sort of payback over very short time periods here is very encouraging and exciting, and maybe pointing to not only the viability, but even sort of returns to scale if we spread the program fixed cost over many participants, which I've been so focused on thinking about, worrying about whether the benefits do materialize. forgetting a little bit that, there's also opportunities in just bringing the cost down substantially with the scale for the non-transfer components. And so then going forward, I think as we think about additional studies, like what's left to uncover here, I think is one important thing is the one gap that remains is the effectiveness of these programs where governments are left to their own devices somewhat, or maybe phrased alternatively, how capacity at a higher level can be built up. So in maybe what we have here is a bit of a proof of concept with respect to scale, but with what I assume is a lot of outsider and research involvement. So there's a question if that itself is easily replicable in other settings. And then one of the questions that still remains very much unanswered is what's really driving heterogeneity across sites. So I've seen this in previous studies as well as in the studies from today. We have some ideas, of course, and we can speculate, but we don't actually have a lot of data points. And so you can count on two hands in some sense. And even though amazingly, these two studies from today, they not only take things to scale, but also try to unbundle the packages, there's a lot of learning to be left why exactly things work differently in different contexts. And so these questions will continue to be important. That said, I think maybe going in the other direction a little bit, I think what we're seeing, like as much as we need to scale and go through government in order to reach scale, these working in smaller settings and with NGOs can kind of really be the driver of innovation, and then including leading the way on the graduation approach in the first place for this type of piloting and proof of concept work that'll continue to be important. And there's a little bit of the question, what do we mean by at scale? If sort of the research part is only a small fraction of it, then I think the programs, the evaluations will look much more like sort of traditional smaller scale NGO-led program evaluations. And then also sort of highlighting again the issue of the target populations. We see small NGOs being involved in refugee settlements, for example, in other settings in which large government programs wouldn't be the first ones that come up. So it's there's an important role there still for those types of programs. Then that said, on the other hand, for some of the questions that we want to go after that are important, but maybe more nuanced, such as spillovers, naturally larger scale programs allow for designs that may not be in the cards with smaller programs. And I think the other panelists that did actually just implement this with governments might be speaking more to the specific challenges that arise. But in terms of what I would imagine where we want to see generate more evidence going forward is especially on scale up, or maybe a couple of things. The first one is just anything that helps with the logistical challenges of large numbers of staff, beneficiaries, and sites in a way that preserves the quality of the non-transfer components, which are likely important. I mean, despite what we have in just seen from Zambia. So going from 200 to 20,000 facilitators, what are the things that can make this more manageable? That's almost necessary to figure out in the process, but it's also where we have very little knowledge. So that might involve technology like mobile device guided facilitation, which should help with the standardization of delivery tool. More generally, probably making things as simple as possible. This also touches on the question of cash versus in-kind transfers, where cash is easier, but many of the programs that are going on and have been evaluated in the past are actually of the in-kind type that don't scale as easily. And then very much related, maybe a second group of things to keep looking at will be innovating on things that help reduce costs but maintain the high returns. Since the upfront costs are, in a sort of practical political economy sense, the biggest barriers to expansion. Some concrete things we've seen some being tested, but we've tested this in other settings, is delivering of coaching in groups, for example, versus individual coaching. That's traditionally the case, which makes things easier and reduces costs. And then generally trimming down on non-essential components. And then along that dimension, I think we need more work figuring out what those essential components are. The evidence there seems to be somewhat conflicting, right? So just now we heard about training not mattering, then in other settings, just giving a livestock without additional components of the program doesn't do the trick. So there's quite some learning still to be done on what the essential components are in which settings. That said, there could be also low cost additions to the program. There's some early promise that the dedicated mental health component could be highly cost-effective addition to the program, where we could would like to see more work on. And then lastly, maybe just I'd also argue in favor of the value of just doing more studies in different contexts. We see all this heterogeneity across sites, and unfortunately, in order to understand why some of the sites are doing better than others, including over the longer run, we do need more data points where the context varies. So in that sense, generating solid evidence from different sites and programs will eventually help us understand what drives the heterogeneity and how to improve program design. Yeah, and I'm happy to jump in with more discussions. I don't know if that covers your questions.
You cover the whole agenda, the whole research agenda. We're very excited. Yes. So let me take a few of these parts and take them apart and get the rest of the panel involved in this discussion. So one message that came out of your comments regards the small scale piloting and experimentation, keeping the NGOs involved, get them to test out different models. This is it's complementary, not a substitute for the at-scale impact evaluations of government-led interventions, but NGOs and governments working together to figuring it out in different contexts and for different populations. The heterogeneity question, what interventions are good for whom and for what geographies and for what type of vulnerable populations, super important one. Very, very interesting point. And the question is, how do we move, with larger scales and larger samples to actually figure out these different interventions for different type of populations? How do we go about doing that? A third question, and really very related question, I think, is whether we can expand and whether we already have experiences with internally displaced populations or externally displaced populations of refugees, and can we apply these same concepts to those populations? So I'd like to open up the discussion to the panel, and of course also to our guests who have been putting a lot of questions online. I hope you've been able to follow some of the questions on the chat box for some of you, and of course for all of you. And so I maybe we start back with Patrick or Joanna, on this question of heterogeneity, and see how we think about those issues in the next stage of our research program. Maybe Patrick, you want to start, then Joanna next?
Yeah, sure. I mean, thank you so much. I think fantastic questions in the chat. I wish we could have many more hours here. But on heterogeneity, so in a way, what I did was contrast the result from Niger and Senegal. But of course, there's questions much beyond that. In a way, looking at what is the profile of beneficiaries that benefit the most from what type of intervention. And is there a way to better tailor what kind of package is needing for whom, depending on the individual profile, on the setting, and so on. So, this is for us the next step of the agenda in the Sahel. We're going to have data from 4 countries coming together. We can do much more of that work. So this is the next steps. At very first look, one surprise in Niger is that we actually didn't seem to find a whole lot of heterogeneity, which was very surprising to us. robust results across. Now, there are some nuances, but at first, that was quite striking. But I do think absolutely that this is the next step. And now, that we have all this rich data coming out, then we'll be able to look at heterogeneity and look at this much more. The other thing that we didn't spend much time on, and that's, I know has been asked in the chat, is on the pathways. And we can't really get to that in a very short presentation, but that's related to that, right? So what are the specific pathways that individual beneficiaries may follow? What are the binding constraints? The constraints have been binding from some than others. Again, this is part of this broader work and very much coming up.
Thank you, Patrick. Joanna?
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Ariana. I think we're kind of at the same stage of analysis in Zambia. As I mentioned, I was just sharing midline results that are still preliminary, and looking at heterogeneity is definitely something we want to explore. Just quickly, what we've looked at a few kind of socio-demographic characteristics. One thing that was surprising for us is that we didn't find any variation based on literacy levels. Literacy levels are very low among the population, and this is something that the government really expected to, to have driven some of the impacts, and it doesn't seem to be borne out by the data. But what we expect might actually be more of a driving force is how connected to the market the beneficiaries and their communities are, because as I mentioned before, something that's very specific, not specific, but a big characteristic of Zambia is that it's very remote, especially the poor rural areas where the intervention is being implemented. So, is being 100 to 200 kilometers from a main market kind of a cap to how much you can increase productivity, increase income generating activities for these beneficiaries. Then maybe since I have the floor, just to quickly respond, because I think this is a really important question about the role of NGOs and the partnership between NGOs and governments. And as I mentioned before, the Zambian government kind of decided to go at it alone from the very beginning. And maybe we can debate whether that was the best decision, or maybe some support, at least in the initial phases, from NGOs would have helped. But I think, yeah, maybe even if the current results aren't that strong, another benefit that's not reflected is that kind of the government has been kind of with us along this journey. And already kind of the results that I've shown are, a couple of years old. In the meantime, the government has continued to learn, has continued to make some adaptations. I know the curriculum, for example, has been revised and slightly simplified to adapt it for these low literacy learnings. And now when we shared the results, kind of immediately the government was on board, and it was like, okay, how do we make this better? How can we ensure that the training is giving us the impacts that we're looking for? And some of the things that are being considered are first kind of reducing this 3-4 level cascade training, so that then there's less of a risk that the information is diluted along the chain. Another one is kind of trying to see whether these community-based volunteers, maybe they're not the right profile, and see whether local ministry staff, so they're a bit over the community, but still quite local, whether they can be better placed in delivering these trainings. And again, the data collection we're conducting now, I think is really going to help us unpack and give the government more precise advice as what to tweak to improve these impacts moving forward. I'll stop here. Thanks.
Thank you, Joanna. Actually, I didn't get any answers on refugee and internally displaced populations, but we can maybe delay that a bit. Before that, I'd like to ask Kanar. So there are a couple of things that were commented on by Joanna, and then last on the use of alternative technologies. So Joanna, in the Zambia's program, there is a distribution of funds, which of course is used to collect data on both control and recipient populations. But of course, as I just came back from Dakar last week, in the past, I would see young men sitting in the street, drinking tea. And now I see young men sitting on the street looking at their smartphone. And the question is, of course, with the great expansion of access to mobile technologies, can we address some of these challenges in reaching out and training and improving literacy and skills through other technologies that may be less costly to implement, and actually test some of these technologies as we scale up these programs to understand the potential for educating youth and other recipients into more productive activities. Kanar.
Merci. Je vais articuler ma réponse autour de 2 points. Le premier concernerait les séances de sensibilisation que nous effectuons en faveur des bénéficiaires. Pendant plus de 5 à 6 ans, c'était en fait des manuels, on convoquait les bénéficiaires, on faisait les séances de sensibilisation tous les 3 mois et ils partaient. Maintenant, on a vu quelque chose en Mauritanie qui nous a paru assez intéressant. C'est qu'en utilisant les nouvelles technologies, les séances de sensibilisation se font sur cette base-là, en utilisant des smartphones, en utilisant des tablettes, d'une part, et d'autre part, il y a des groupes qui sont constitués, des groupes de bénéficiaires qui sont constitués. Et on leur donne, une fois que la séance est terminée, on leur donne le smartphone ou la tablette, ou parfois ça peut même être une radio avec des messages qui sont préenregistrés. Et ces groupes-là se retrouvent ensemble, vu qu'ils sont du même village ou du même quartier, ils se retrouvent ensemble et ils ont la possibilité de bien s'approprier les messages qui sont véhiculés à travers ces nouvelles technologies. Et nous nous rendons compte que ça donne des résultats beaucoup plus probants et ça permet également aux ménages de gagner du temps. Parce que ce n'est pas toujours très facile parfois, surtout en milieu rural, de se déplacer d'un village à un autre pour aller à des séances de sensibilisation. Donc, il y a ce qu'on appelle des interséances qui ont été introduites et cela permet en fait aux bénéficiaires de mieux s'approprier les messages. C'est pour ça que nous proposons dans la mise à l'échelle justement du programme de protection sociale adaptative d'être plus flexible d'une part, parce qu'en fait, on avait des conditionnalités qui sont axés sur la présence en séance de sensibilisation. Maintenant, avec l'utilisation des nouvelles technologies, ça aide vraiment et ça met plus à l'aise les ménages. Le deuxième aspect, c'est par rapport au paiement, bien entendu. Nous développons depuis 2015 le paiement via les téléphones. Donc, on a, par exemple, pour les opérations de réponse au choc, aux inondations, c'est essentiellement cela que nous avons utilisé. Le paiement électronique a été utilisé en faveur de tous les bénéficiaires qui étaient accompagnés. Pareil pour la réponse à l'insécurité alimentaire. Donc, depuis 2015, nous sommes vraiment à l'aise dans l'utilisation du paiement électronique. Il y a un troisième aspect qui me paraît important, eu égard justement à l'expérience qu'on a du programme national de bourse. Au tout début, les enquêteurs se rendaient au niveau des ménages avec des fiches à remplir à la main. Et on était seulement à 50 000 ménages. Actuellement, nous sommes à 316 000 ménages. Mais nous sommes certains que si nous n'avions pas introduit l'utilisation des tablettes pour recueillir directement les données via des logiciels, via des plateformes, on aurait difficilement pu passer à cette mise à l'échelle, passer de 50 000 ménages à 316 000 ménages. Maintenant, les enquêteurs qui vont sur le terrain, ils y vont avec des tablettes, ils collectent les données directement, ils font la saisie directement. Et vu que nous travaillons avec l'Agence de l'informatique de l'État, tout cela, en fait, se retrouve dans un serveur qui est sauvegardé. Et après, ça permet vraiment de gagner de gagner en rapidité d'une part, mais également de gagner en fiabilité. Et c'est justement cela qui nous a permis de développer notre registre national unique dans un temps très, très, très court. Merci.
Oh, that's super interesting. Not only it is a way forward, but it is actually, from what I hear from you, Kanar, an enabling factor in the scale up of these programs. The ability to count on new technologies, to register, track, monitor inform, train the list, and of course transfer resources. This is really an enabling factor to make these programs scalable and monitorable. I'd like to move it, perhaps just a short follow-up question on capacity constraints and how much you think we should be focusing on building capacities in government for these functions, which are more on the side of data systems and analytical capacity to support the programs. Kanar, did you
Alors,
get
toujours
a
en
translation?
fait, dans le cadre de la mise à l'échelle, je me devais de préciser qu'il y a vraiment une bonne collaboration qui est effectuée avec l'agence qui s'occupe des statistiques. Donc, c'est l'agence qui s'occupe de toutes les enquêtes au niveau du Sénégal, premièrement. Deuxièmement, il y a également l'agence de l'informatique de l'État. Donc, c'est l'agence qui est censée coordonner la politique de système d'information, de gestion des données au niveau du Sénégal. Donc, ces deux agences-là sont également des partenaires d'exécution, si je puis dire ainsi, des programmes de protection sociale que nous menons. Donc, il y a des experts, bien entendu, très compétents qui accompagnent tout le processus que nous faisons. Donc, et c'est à l'aune des études qu'ils mènent, à l'aune également des innovations qu'ils introduisent, que nous arrivons à avoir plus de flexibilité et également à gagner en compétences. C'est également eux qui s'occupent tout le temps du renforcement de capacité des prestataires, des ONG et autres qui nous accompagnent. Il y a un aspect qui me paraît important. Vous l'avez dit tout à l'heure, il y a une bonne introduction maintenant au niveau des ménages des nouvelles technologies, notamment les smartphones. Et comme on est au niveau du ministère du Développement communautaire, il y a une direction dans ce ministère-là qui a pour rôle d'organiser les bénéficiaires, de les structurer afin qu'ils puissent être davantage réceptifs aux nouvelles technologies d'une part, mais également davantage réceptifs à toutes les innovations que nous essayons de mettre en place. Donc, à côté des ONG, nous avons également une administration décentralisée qui accompagne le renforcement de capacités, l'introduction des innovations, mais également l'introduction des nouvelles technologies en faveur des bénéficiaires. Un point également qui me paraît important, on en a parlé tout à l'heure, c'est que, eu égard à tous les résultats que nous avons eus en moins de 10 ans, le gouvernement du Sénégal cherche à mettre en place un centre d'excellence sur la protection sociale. Et ce centre d'excellence sur la protection sociale aura pour rôle d'accompagner par des études, par la recherche d'évidence scientifique, mais également aller faire du benchmarking, chercher des nouvelles innovations, d'accompagner le gouvernement justement à s'adapter à toutes les innovations que nous avons de par le monde, d'une part, mais d'autre part, à accompagner également le renforcement de capacité des différents acteurs de l'écosystème de la protection sociale. Ça, c'est vraiment un grand projet du gouvernement du Sénégal. Nous avons partagé l'étude de faisabilité la dernière fois et on se rend compte que tous les acteurs allant des élus locaux à la société civile, les ONG, en passant bien entendu par les autorités administratives, adhèrent à ce projet de centre d'excellence qui vraiment va faciliter l'introduction des innovations et surtout le renforcement de capacités des acteurs d'une part, mais également des bénéficiaires de protection sociale. Merci.
Great, thank you, Kanar. I want to follow up with kind of the literature on training and ask maybe Patrick and Las to comment briefly, as we don't have a lot of time left, but briefly on what does the evidence say and how should we think about these training components? Are there a couple of bullet points that we should keep in mind when we start training programs as part of these economic inclusion programs?
Should I go first? Yeah, so I'd say the evidence overall is still pretty limited. So we've got these studies here that made another attempt at unbundling, and there's sort of a small number of studies that looks at the unbundling, but overall, I don't think we have kind of very solid evidence base for what types of non-transfer components are crucial and in which settings, which goes back to the heterogeneity questions from earlier.
I guess my question is more on the training literature, because here we're just unbundling, but unbundling the training, looking at what type of training has been shown to work better in, not as part of these programs, but in general, to guide the selection of training for these programs.
Yeah, so I've been involved in the graduation programs, in the trainings that are provided there. I think I'm not so familiar with the wider spread of trainings. I think financial literacy has for example, a kind of a mixed record, works in some settings and then seemingly not in many others. Business trainings also have a quite mixed record, but then clearly, if productive assets are given, there's large complementarity to the actually being able to handle it. But then here, training in the graduation setting doesn't mean only technical training, but there is not a lot of evidence on that directly, but it seems true that there is both the capabilities from the technical point, but also from the psychological point. And so that's important to keep in mind, right? And so the early evidence that we have on the mental health, adding a mental health component is very positive. And more broadly, this should also inform our discussions about the technology. If the idea is that, if it's important that there's an interaction with another human who's looking how is progress going, and that element of coaching, if that turns out to be important, then that sort of is a very different type of training than technical training. Though then maybe one other aspect to this is that over the longer run, or maybe thinking about expanding beyond this sort of one-off bump of 10% of consumption, it seems obvious that the next layer for, as you mentioned in the beginning, of economic growth would need to involve education and additional training. I'm not sure what the best pathways for that are, if that's necessarily in a short run training where you work with the limited set of skills of adults, but then on the younger generation, of course, there's much more a longer run path for kind of intergenerational improvements in education, which will likely be key for moving this beyond like a one-time bump in consumption.
I think this is a really hard question, Ariana, to answer in 2 minutes, but maybe just to say that, on the business training, we have seen that, reviews have shown that the more traditional business training may not be as effective as training targeting personal initiative would be one example of that. I think the Niger results speak to this a little bit. So Catherine is in the audience. She designed a lot of this. In Niger, it's focusing both on the personal side, but also on the interpersonal and social side of things. We are working with Catherine on unpacking the pathways and the mechanism behind this, whether, is it more the personal side or the interpersonal side in a way. So I think, I think there's a lot here that goes into that, but we, at least from where we stand, see a lot of value in those kind of non-traditional approaches rooted in the social psychology. So we see this as very kind of an exciting space moving forward. Now it requires a lot of tailoring. You cannot just take any training and call it life skills. Like it require really careful thinking on the behavioral side as well. But I think this is an exciting space to take forward and a challenging one when you think about scale.
Oh, that's great. And also a space for NGOs to contribute, I think, quite widely. So we do have a lot of, I've read through the different participants, a lot of the NGOs that are providing support to these programs. I like to use the last 5 minutes of this session to discuss economic-wide effects that would go beyond the direct studies on these programs, and kind of thinking with you, how do we even set up the data and capabilities to look at these wider and the spillover effects at community level and beyond, understanding what is the longer term impact that we could expect and whether there are ways of looking at it. I noticed that a few studies out there, not many, looking at, for example, in Brazil, at the Bolsa Familia program, and looking over the whole implementation period over the years, and kind of extracting the economic impact of those programs. Any comments you have on how we should think of those to inform what Kanar mentioned earlier as fiscal constraints, understanding whether those are actual investments into economic growth that we can expect, or should we still think of this as a social protection, improving resilience, but not necessarily contributing to the economic bottom line? And the question is open to all the panelists. Please turn on your mic if you have comments on that.
Sure, maybe I can come in, because as I said, we are planning to measure spillover and general equilibrium effects in Zambia. And the way we're able to do this and kind of like to answer the question, how do you set it up? We were actually quite lucky, and we were able to take advantage of oversubscription to the project and have kind of the targeting process, the beneficiary identification process, culminate in a public lottery. So after there were a couple of steps beforehand, there was a list of women who were eligible for the project in each community, and that list was longer than the number of places available. We did the public lottery, and then for the impact evaluation, we sampled both like winners and losers, so that now we're able to compare the two and see whether women of the same profile who participated in the project are doing better, or how are they doing better than those who didn't have a chance to receive the program. And for us, this was really important to measure, as I said, because as we think about like broader development impacts, we cannot just focus on the beneficiaries. We have to look at the community more broadly. And on one hand, we wanted to make sure that the positive effects that we see on our beneficiaries aren't matched with negative impacts on others. So there's no like displacement going on, like now our beneficiary, sells tomatoes, but someone else can no longer do this. And second, I think there's reason to believe that there can be positive spillovers or kind of general equilibrium effects. And I think evidence coming from Bangladesh that comes to my mind, where because more economic inclusion beneficiaries focused on businesses, they no longer worked as like daily laborers, or I guess I think mainly domestic workers in the case of Bangladesh. So because the supply decreased, wages increased, and even non-beneficiaries were able to benefit indirectly. So I think that's something very interesting. We don't have the results yet, but we're definitely very excited to look into that and see what these effects are. And just like on long-term effects, there are actually at this point long-term effects on economic inclusion interventions, not just cash transfers. Again, coming mainly from India and Bangladesh, and they're now 9 or 10 years out. And they show that not only have the positive effects been maintained, but actually kind of investments in assets and I think like land have increased over time. So I think that's again like really promising as we move forward with these interventions in Africa and other regions as well. Thanks.
The screen reminds me we have a poll going on with participants. Please contribute your thoughts. We are at 11 o'clock. Just last thought from Patrick or Kanar.
Maybe just to your last question, like, is that social protection or is that investment? I mean, in my mind, there is no question. Like when we see the rates of returns in Niger, for instance, I mean, there is no question this contributes to the economic bottom line. At the same time, I think what we still need more of, and Kanar alluded to that, is what does this mean in terms of aggregates reduction in poverty and aggregate contribution to growth? So I mean, I think that's the link that would be good to make more clear moving forward. Thank you.
Last.
Yeah, so I think from the just on that specific question, the spillovers we've seen in a recent study we just completed in Uganda in a refugee and host setting, a positive on the same types of people, like Joanna was just referring to. I think there's a gross effect that has to be negative. If people are opening businesses, then they're obviously competing with others. So there's a mechanical effect where there are negative spillovers. The question is if on net, for the types of population we care about, the spillovers are positive. And I think the evidence so far is sort of slightly positive, definitely nothing kind of showing that there's negative immediate competition. And then over the longer run, or like more broadly for the economy, is these questions, as you mentioned, about economic growth. And I think the theory would be fairly positive based on the fact that what's happening is kind of you're alleviating constraints so that you're complementing, for example, slack labor or unproductive labor with capital and training to improve that. And so the net benefit from that in the long run should be positive even for the economy more widely.
Thank you, everyone. This was a super interesting session. I think a lot of takeaways. Thank you for all the participants and our panelists. And we shall close. We're slightly late on our schedule. Thank you very much. And until the next time.
Thank you.